This is the tough portion of the day. We were talking about regulation and export control. Naama will make it easy for us. She's a seasoned attorney at the Israeli satellite industry and has worked with both within the traditional space industry as well as the new space industry. She is awesome at subcontractor contracts and launch contracts and whatever, but now she will speak about the export control law in Israel and regulation. Naama.
Well, it's really a joy to be here and be part of this wonderful conversation of the commercial space industry as to the opportunities and the challenges ahead. And until now, a lot of the talk has been about the opportunities, and there are some challenges as well. And I guess I would say that regulation is probably more of a challenge than an opportunity. But as Ofer said, I'm actually here to try to demystify that challenge by giving you a little bit of an overview of commercial space export control in Israel, and it's really an inextricable part of being a space startup, a space company in Israel. And since a lot of times regulations can be a barrier to entry, so the more you understand about the regulation, the less you have a barrier. The first thing that you need to understand about Israeli export licensing regulations is that they're built on international building blocks. So actually, they're based on international norms. And when I say international norms, what I mean is that there are international lists that kind of define what items, what equipment, what technologies we want to regulate in being exported around the world. And specifically, I want to talk about 3 international lists that really define what constitutes missiles, what constitutes weapons, and what constitutes dual-use items whose export we want to control. Specifically, I want to talk about the lists that have been created by the Missile Technology Control Regime, by the Wassenaar Arrangement, and the Wassenaar Arrangement actually created 2 lists. It created a weapons list, a munitions list, and it also created a dual-use list. And of course, these lists go on, but I'm going to focus on the space elements of those lists. And I'm going to talk also about the Pareto. I'm not going to go through the whole list. I'm going to talk about what's probably most interesting to most of you. So first, we're going to start with the Missile Technology Control Regime. And what you need to know about it is that it's divided into 2 categories. Category 1 being the really dangerous stuff, what's really considered dangerous missiles. Category 2 also being pretty dangerous, but not quite as dangerous. So what you've got in category 1 is you've got space launch vehicles, basically any and every space launch vehicle, with no distinction between military and civilian space launch vehicles, is considered a missile. The only distinction, if you'll see, since space launch vehicles are mentioned both in category 1 and 2, the only distinction is the size of the payload, where category 1 is space launch vehicles that carry payloads of 500 kilograms and over. And in category 2, we've got the space launch vehicles that carry smaller payloads. In category 2, we also have all kinds of components that go into the space launch vehicles, such as propellants. And it's very important for people here to be familiar with this list, which really has international ramifications, because if 15 years ago talking about a commercial space launch company seemed very theoretical, in the age of SpaceX and all these other companies, I would love to see, and maybe it's not so crazy to think about two women here getting together, putting together a development center in Israel, finding an island to launch from, but they're going to need to know about MTCR for that purpose. So the second list that I'm going to talk about and again, Pareto-wise, we're going to focus on what's most interesting to you guys, and that's going to be in the Wassenaar Arrangement munitions list, category 11 out of 22. The munitions list comes to define internationally by a wide international consensus what is considered to be a munition. And there are really no surprises here. If you look at category 11, if you're designing your spacecraft or modifying it for military use, well, guess what? It's a weapon. I think the more interesting list to look at and for you to familiarize yourselves with is the dual use list. That's a less intuitive list, and it's also a much bigger list because there are many more dual use technologies out there. And again, I'm going to focus not on everything, we can't, so we're just going to focus on Pareto-wise what is most interesting probably to most people here, and that would be category 9. aerospace and propulsion. And within Category 9, there are also all kinds of parts that are interesting, but what's probably most interesting to most people here is Category 9A4, because that's the category that turns all space launch vehicles, all spacecraft buses, and most spacecraft payloads to the extent that they incorporate items specified elsewhere into dual-use items. And basically, if you take a look at these three lists that I've now discussed, what you see is, generally speaking, that if you're going to be working in the space industry and creating space goods or technologies, then basically you're going to be dealing with either what's considered munitions around the world or dual-use items. Now, how do these norms now translate into Israeli regulations? So first of all, their very existence, even though Israel is not a part of the arrangements whereby these lists were created, but their very existence creates a certain international obligation on Israel. Israel wants to play in the world playground, and so it has to also subscribe to international norms. And if these are the norms, then this is what Israel has to regulate as well. But it's more than that, of course. The Defense Export Control Law in Israel, which was enacted in 2007 and is basically the tool for regulating munitions and dual-use items in general, is also moved not only by international obligations but by foreign policy considerations. That's definitely one of the bases for determining what can go where in the world. And of course, ultimately, the most important thing for every country is its own vital interests, its own national interests, whether it's defense or other vital interests, and that is also the basis for the export control regime in Israel. And the Defense Export Control Law, I call it the Deca Bible. Deca is the agency in Israel that is in charge of regulating all the exports of all the items that you saw before, with a slightly different twist. So now let me introduce you a little bit more to the Deca Bible, and of course we're going to talk about how it pertains specifically to the space industry as well. So first of all, at the core of the Deca Bible, we've got the definition of defense equipment, because Deca regulates defense equipment. And now that you've seen these other three lists, I think that you'll understand why it is that the definition of defense equipment constitutes missile equipment, combat equipment, and controlled dual-use equipment. So missile equipment is pretty much 100%, and 100% overlaps with the MTCR list. Controlled dual-use equipment is also basically 100% that Wassenaar dual-use list that you saw before, but Deca only regulates it to the extent that the item is being exported to a defense user or a defense use. The more interesting list, which doesn't entirely correlate with the Wassenaar list, and it is controlled by Deca as well, is the combat equipment list. And we're going to talk about that a little later, because that's also of most interest to the people here. But first, I'm going to tell you that Deca regulates not just defense equipment, it also regulates defense services and defense know-how when they're exported. And those two definitions are, of course, a function of the definition of defense equipment. Defense services relate to defense equipment, defense know-how pertains to defense equipment. There is another regulatory entity here in the game, and that's the Economy Ministry. And as of now, it regulates all the dual-use equipment that goes for civilian purposes that isn't regulated by Deca. I also have a little block there for encryption, because that's also regulated by a different authority, and encryption is definitely a part of the satellite industry in this day and age. So let's take a look at what's a little bit different about Israeli space export regulations as of now. So the difference between the international norm, let's say, and Israeli export regulation has to do with the combat equipment list. That list is not doesn't completely overlap with the Wassenaar list as it stands today. And it's important to also note that the three lists that I talked about before, they get updated every year because technology changes all the time, so you really have to keep up with the times. And so the missile equipment list and the dual-use list, those get updated as the international lists get updated. But the combat equipment list is actually a translation. It's a Hebrew translation of the list as it was in 2007 when these regulations were enacted. And in addition to the translation, there are also a few Israel-specific additions, add-ons, that are unique to Israel, one of which is very important for the people sitting here because it's Section 22 and it deals with spacecraft, related equipment, and their products. And you've got basically all the satellites that were around in 2007 and 8. You've got systems and equipment for launch. You've got ground stations. You've got all kinds of satellite imageries with no distinctions as to the resolution. And you also have a pretty wide interpretation of this clause by Deca. So what you have in effect is you have Deca controlling basically all of the exports of the space industry. Again, I'm generalizing a little bit, but this is basically the situation. And I will note that this is basically the situation also that existed in the United States in 2007, around the time that this law was enacted. Now, what does it mean to be regulated by Deca? So it's a process. The first thing that you need to do as an entity regulated by Deca is basically the day that you register your company or you start your startup in whatever way in stealth mode, go register at Deca, because that's going to be a pretty long process, and it's not just going to be filling out paperwork. It also can include a background check. Step 2 is register and classify your product. I know that you're just starting out and you still need to talk to customers and things are going to change, but you've got to go register and classify your product. And when I say classify your product, I don't mean just figure out whether it's in category 9 or dual use. Deca is going to figure out whether they want to classify your product as sensitive or less sensitive, and that's going to impact the way that they treat your product later on when you apply for the various licenses. Step 3 is applying for a marketing license, and this is also a little bit unusual. It doesn't quite fit with the international norm because a marketing license is required in Israel for any activity basically aimed at promoting a defense export transaction. So that's a pretty wide range of activities that require a marketing license for your business. And because this requirement is so vast and really so cumbersome, over the last 10 years, there have been all kinds of carve-outs created. Unfortunately, a lot of those carve-outs do not apply to the space industry, where there's specifically an exception to the exception, and a lot of the carve-outs don't apply to satellites and their products. So the marketing license process is going to be pretty lengthy because it doesn't just involve Deca. It also involves the foreign ministry. We talked about geopolitical considerations, and it also involves the defense ministry, and that can take a while. But once Deca knows who you are, knows your product, and has given you a marketing license and they know your customer, the last step is actually pretty easy. At that point, you apply for an export license, and most of the work is done, so that step really is not going to be the time-consuming step. So this is the situation as of today. And if you're kind of wondering why it is that we got to this regulatory norm in Israel that is a bit more stringent, I would say, than the norm elsewhere. So there are two reasons. A, I touched on the first reason, which is that in 2007, when this law was enacted, we were very much looking not only to the international VASNAR norms, but also to the US norm. And at the time, the US norm was also, I would say, definitely stricter, and so a lot of what you see, not only, but also in the way that the space regulations are enacted here, was a bit of an echo of the US approach. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is that 2007 was really before new space exploded on the scene. And people have been talking a lot about how new space has to do with making things cheaper, more cost-effective, more accessible. But I think one of the things that's come out of the conversations here over the last 2 days is that new space is also about a paradigm shift and really harnessing space for so many civilian applications, for so many ecological, agricultural, humanitarian applications, and that all comes with new space. And that really all exploded onto the scene over the last 10 years after this law was regulated, was enacted. So basically, after this law was enacted, and we also saw that the US went through a major export control reform over recent years, which affected also, but not only, the satellite industry, and moved a lot of the regulation of what was traditionally considered munitions, and specifically all kinds of commercial satellite endeavors that were considered munitions, over to the Ministry of Commerce in the United States, Israeli manufacturers and the Israeli industry was also looking for a similar kind of change because, regulation, like I said earlier, it's a barrier to entry, and you've got to be, in a way, you've got to level the playing field. You've got to kind of have the same kind of hoops to jump through that your competitors do. Otherwise, you really can't compete. So when export control reform, or after export control reform, came to the United States, Israeli manufacturers and the Israeli industry started talking to. And the good news is that it took time, but somebody actually listened. And in 2016, in July 2016, Deca came to the Knesset with a new munitions list, a new and improved munitions list. And the improvements in the list certainly affect the space industry. Number one, there's no longer an Israeli translation of the munitions list, but rather there's going to be a direct connection between the munitions list as it gets updated by Vassinar and the Israeli list. And there are still Israeli add-ons in Hebrew, but what you don't have among those Israeli add-ons is you don't have that section 22 with the catch-all regulation of the space industry. What you have left is just satellite imageries of a resolution to be defined by Deca. And yesterday, we talked about how the higher resolution is usually military and the lower resolution is commercial. So what you're going to have, in effect, is you're going to have the lower resolution imagery is moving over to the Ministry of Commerce. And that move is going to happen with, again, a lot of the commercial dual-use items moving over to the regulation of the Economy Ministry in Israel rather than Deca. And that means a much more streamlined regulation process because the Economy Ministry, as of today, doesn't have a registration requirement, a classification requirement. Most importantly, it doesn't require marketing licenses. And I'm sure that as more content moves over to the Ministry of Economy, I'm sure that the regulations are also going to get a little bit more robust, but they'll still never be like regulating munitions. So this is really wonderful news for the space industry. But don't forget that this new list was placed at the Knesset a year and a half ago. And what's happened over the last year and a half? Well, everybody got a little quiet. The space industry got very far in getting Deca to recognize the need for change. But now, before I hand over the mic to the next speaker, I kind of want to hand things over to you guys because we got this far, we got this new list to the Knesset and Deca to realize that there was a need for it because people spoke up. And I think that now, in order to finally make that change, make the paradigm shift, the industry has to be involved because regulation is an ongoing dialogue and it's hard for government to keep up with what's going on in industry. So I call on all of you to get involved.